All right, so this lecture is going to talk a little bit about the history of public relations, thinking a little bit about the different models of public relations, and the ways that those sorts of things have kind of changed with time. Um, Obviously, public relations is a growing and evolving field, just like all the others. But um, some of the things that we think about in the 21st century are very influenced by what went down in the 21st or in the 20th century, as it relates to what PR stands for, what the ethical implications are, and so we'll look at some of that here. So when we talk about public relations, PR has evolved from what it once was, thanks to several different factors. That we're looking at an industry that is responsible for communicating messages to audiences of millions. When you think about the companies, the biggest companies on the planet, they all have PR people working for them. They are huge organizations, huge corporations that require, public relations to communicate uh, various aspects of their companies to various audiences around the world. When you think of a brand like Coca-Cola, when you think of a brand like Apple, right? All of these companies, while they're selling us products and marketing their services and things to us, also have to be in the business of ensuring that we are that they are communicating transparently to us and we are feeling very positive about them. And so that is something that has absolutely changed in the last several decades. Um, and companies today are very aware of what they need, or they should be very aware of what they need to do in order to communicate these things, right? It's no longer just enough for a company or for a business to post a mission statement and maybe, a few little bits and pieces about what they do to, uphold the values that they've established as a company. They have to have websites full of this stuff, the things that they do, the initiatives that they take, how they, what it's like to work for the company, what they're doing to help the environment. I mean, if you go on any company website, you're going to find all of these things, right? The things they're doing in order to um, develop their corporate social responsibility. So lots of different factors play a role in what public relations looks like today. It's not just the practice of writing press releases. It involves interviews. It involves communicating with the media. Being available and transparent in ways that companies really didn't have to do or be 30 years ago, 40 years ago, because the internet has changed so much of how we communicate. And so lots of different things have really changed the factors that are included in public relations, and these things evolve with time. They change with technology. They change with the industry and the what is going on. And it's a reflection of what's going on in society. So public relations is really the art of influence and persuasion. Of course, that goes way, way back, not even into the 20th century, but even further back than that. The idea of rhetoric and persuading is something that is very much a concept we talk about in public speaking, but the use of communication skills and language to influence audiences, to present a sound argument, to propose ideas and things and use all sorts of manners of speaking, all techniques possible to do that in a logically sound and coherent way. And so those sorts of things have evolved with time. That we see, into the 18th century. Thomas Paine, if you remember your American history, sending out essays and pamphlets urging colonists to band together, using just the moment in history, using that influential language, the use of media, in this case, very sort of basic compared to what we have today, but the use of media to communicate a message and urge and persuade people to act or think or change their sorts of ways of thinking. Um, The First Amendment rights, of course, which we'll talk a little bit about, um, allow for this, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, but of course, ethics are involved with this, and um, uh, that is going to also be something that public relations specialists need to consider. Is while you have the ability to influence and persuade, how are you using that? How are you using your language um, to ensure that what you're communicating is ethical, and it's not defaming anybody. It's not something that is unscrupulous or spinning the language. And then moving into some more modern examples, here we have what is called muckraking. And muckraking is basically investigative journalism. So, of course, the practice still valued today. The ways that journalists and writers looked to report on scandals of all kinds. I mean, these kinds of things still happen today. Injustices, things that are being swept under the rug, right? Practices and shady business situations. Muckraking journalism was the start of that investigative journalism industry. Whistleblowers are a great example of this. But again, right? Um, Holding organizations and companies accountable. So it all overlaps. It is all part of a process of shaping perceptions, influencing audiences, and these sorts of skills are perfected with the media of the time. So when we talk about public relations in the 21st century and into the middle of the 20th century, well, 20th century into the today of the 21st century, um, that there has been a shift in how public relations is perceived. We start out with P.T. Barnum, who we will get to in a second here. P.T. Barnum is a name you're probably familiar with the P.T. Barnum and Bailey Circus. He was very unethical in his kind of behaviors and practices when it comes to influencing and changing behaviors. But what we think about today is honesty. Organizations and businesses should be honest with their communication, should be honest with their messaging. Of course, that is the hope. That is not always the case. But we should be using this space and this moment, right? The ability to persuade and influence in ways that communicate integrity, honesty, good decision making, transparency, effective communication, and all that good stuff. So we're going to get into Edward Bernays in a second here, but this sort of thing has kind of, I guess, a product of the 20th century and our very mediated lives that we live in are what are known as pseudo events. There's the PDF will tell you a little bit more about pseudo events. But when we move into the 20th century and our very mediated, televised kind of world that came out of that time, pseudo events sort of were a product of that environment. And we have them to this day. Um, a pseudo event is basically an event that is created for the sake of publicity, for the sake of generating conversation, for the sake of generating media coverage, and the goal is to make it appear sort of unplanned or spontaneous. But these kinds of events are very, very um, thoroughly planned out in order to communicate a particular message or perspective that is uh, that organization or that celebrity or that whoever wants to communicate to the public. And we still do this today. I'm going to go over the characteristics of a pseudo event in a second here. But really, the goal of something like this is to get the news media to cover it. It may appear like something newsworthy, but it's really a very skillfully coordinated plan to get us talking about something that maybe we otherwise wouldn't be talking about. So that's what I had just said here, is that it is planned and staged, right? A pseudo event is something that The goal is to send a message, to create some kind of outcome, and to use this mediated environment that we live in today to drive a particular narrative, shape the public's perceptions of an issue. And these are things like press conferences, photo ops, ribbon cutting ceremonies, things that are very much planned. And of course, if you've ever seen a press conference, right, the goal is to get as many journalists at the press conference as possible to ask questions and have people answer them. Sometimes press conferences are just really a chance for somebody to speak, but the goal is to have a very coordinated um, uh, interaction that can be covered by mass media. And so doing these kinds of events shapes public opinion, it generates buzz, creates news coverage, and is a way to get your particular topic or issue or story into a very, very cluttered media environment, right? We are constantly bombarded by messages, constantly bombarded with information. And so um, uh, um, a pseudo event like this is something that is going to uh, allow for your story or your event to become something that people actually talk about. And the more news coverage you have on on your pseudo event, the better, right? That is always the hope. A great example of this is Time Magazine's top 100 most influential people. Um, That's their news story, right? Their news story is top 100 people that they list 100 most influential people that they list every year, right? Of course, these lists are created by the magazine and are hyped and circulated for weeks and weeks and weeks, right? We don't know who's going to be on the list. We might not know. We may have speculation. We don't know how people are going to be ranked and for what reasons. But really, this is just a news story, right? This is a manufactured conversation starter. Um, we are hyping it up with all that you can see here, right? They have different covers that reflect all of these different people that they put on their list. um and of course the social media space is going to promote this, right? There may be polls, there may be like social media content, all of it is going to direct people to this story that Time could just release as part of a news story in their magazine and call it a day, but instead it's a very hyped up um uh pseudo event for their magazine. It generates some buzz. We think about who's excluded, who's not on the list. It gets conversation going. Um, and of course, with this come high profile events. And they did a 100th year celebration situation here for Time when they released their 100 most influential people. So they, of course, had an event with celebrities, and there are a million pictures of celebrities showing up to this thing, and they stand in front of the big wall with the Time 100, and Cadillac is sponsoring it. And these pictures circulate. And so this generates interest in the top 100, and maybe people visit the website, they buy the magazine. Okay, so you get the picture. What was not a story has become a very big story. Um, okay. All right. So when we start to look at the ways that public relations has changed with time, one of the things that the textbook kind of talks about is this shift from one-way communication to two-way communication. And one-way communication is a very sort of old school way of thinking about mass media. Early in the days of communication research, when mass media was becoming something worth studying in the early 1900s, um, the understanding was that mass media was a one-way thing, right? That an organization or a newspaper or a magazine had a message and they sent it to the receiver and we all kind of consumed it and that was it. And that is really what one-way communication looks like, right? There is no sort of feedback from the receiver. Um, the message once it gets to the receiver is completed, right? So the newspaper, like a tabloid magazine or a newspaper article, goes out into the world, people read it, and that is the end. With advancements in technology and things like that, those things have changed. um But P.T. Barnum was a great example of his use of one-way communication. Maybe you know him from the Barnum and Bailey Circus. This guy was weird. He um, really enjoyed duping the public. He was very good at it, used his clever and very strange, um, I don't know what you would call it, just very sort of strange ways of attracting people, using stuff that didn't was sounded too good to be true, to get people into his sort of traveling expositions, and did not care that he was doing it unethically. Was a master of pseudo events, right? So those big events made for uh, um, media attention, and generated buzz around his kinds various different sorts of like projects, if you want to call it a project. But he wanted the media coverage. He wanted people's eyes on what he was doing. And one of his most famous pseudo event situations, what was known as the Fiji Mermaid. And I've so carefully and considerately included it on this slide here. The Fiji Mermaid, if you look at the news article in the corner, does not look like what was displayed at one of his little events. This is what he said was that they had captured an actual mermaid and said that this was, a real mermaid on display that people could come and see. This is the head of a monkey sewn onto the back of a fish. Very weird, and was what he displayed on at his announcement of this Fiji mermaid, right? And of course, in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, nobody has the internet. We don't have Google, so you couldn't check the veracity of these things. And uh, he was okay with tricking and fooling the public. What were they going to say, right? Was this a real mermaid or not? It's really weird, and kind of freaky when you look at it, but was something that he felt very passionately about. And so a lot of PR practitioners would not even include P.T. Barnum kind of in the discussion of public relations, because when you think about it, he was doing none of this ethically, right? There were no ethics involved. He was not thinking about what um, what the repercussions were. He just wanted media attention and people to get through the door. Our next information model here is the public information model, which is another one-way communication, but focusing more on reputation here, right? P.T. Barnum didn't care. He was just psyched to have attention on his antics. The public information model is a little bit more transparent, a little bit more of a overlap with journalism and news to communicate with the public. And this was something that we see starting in the 1920s, trying to provide updates and important information to the public from an organization, right? This is the start of that like real kind of reputation centered public relations model that we see today. And Ivy Ledbetter is the name associated with that kind of philosophy. So P.T. Barnum said the public be damned. Ivy Ledbetter said public be informed. That he was one of the first to think about PR as a way to tell the truth, to be transparent. He was also the first person to issue a press release, which is a kind of interesting little bit of history here. But his goal was to make that relationship between his client and the public a positive one. He tried really hard to, see value in the humanizing and humanizing of clients and individuals, and being transparent and straightforward with the public. And this is a practice that continues on today. Um, right? The hope is that organizations, people, whoever, are being as transparent as possible. And this is sort of the start of that practice in the start of the 20th century here. The next one we have here, we start to move from that one-way communication model into a two-way communication model. So the one way was really just an organization, an individual communicating to the public, and that being the end of the interaction. But in this case, we're moving into a two-way symmetrical communication model where there is feedback. The sender and the receiver communicate, and this is where we start to see a bit more of a complex view of how persuasive messages can influence people and shape how people see and view the world. Edward Bernays is the name that we associate with this sort of philosophy. He came from, he was the nephew, related somehow um, to Freud. So a little more psychologically kind of influenced in his philosophy of the use of persuasion and propaganda. And we're going to read his book Propaganda later on. But he is the first person to really kind of think about the manipulation of audiences, the manipulation of messages, how these mediated moments that we are kind of inundated with um, shape how we view the world around us, how we act, who is kind of in that powerful space to shape how we think, what we buy, the decisions that we make day to day. And he is credited with convincing the public to eat bacon and eggs for breakfast because he was contacted by, um, farmers in the industry to enhance the sales of pork, and that is how we got to eating bacon for breakfast, which is really powerful and really persuasive to kind of think about how one person just used his messaging and his ability to influence to shape such a kind of fundamental practice in America. And then lastly, we have the two-way symmetrical communication model. Again, very much so of the philosophy that there is feedback, that things are going two ways, and that the audience has a role in this as well, right? That we are, as consumers, able to negotiate, able to kind of communicate back to that sender. That we're not sort of just like sitting there waiting to be influenced and accepting the fact that we're influenced, but also thinking about how we can, be resistant to that kind of manipulation. So when we think about the history of public relations, there are obviously some big names that come up in the history of what public relations looks like. Um, the technology has changed how what PR looks like today. Even though press releases were a huge part of the middle of the 20th century, and those practices continue on today, that we're seeing a shift in what PR looks like because of technology and social media and the expectations of the public for what needs to be communicated within a timely manner. Um, so the building of those relationships and maintaining um, the those lines of communication are very important. And we've, as those models have evolved, kind of view the public as way more interactive and way more educated and willing to kind of think critically about those messages than P.T. Barnum was thinking about the turn of the 20th, or yeah, the 20th century. And so building these relationships is important, and those kinds of industries that were once very sort of on their own, things like journalism and marketing, have all kind of blurred together thanks to what media convergence does, right? These are not just sort of siloed industries working on their own to do the jobs that they have to do. These things overlap now, and we see a big influence of all of these industries kind of meeting in these very mediated spaces that we live in today.